in the thick, briny air of the Caribbean, where the ocean swelled beneath a burning sun and time seemed to drift with the tide. Pirate ships cut through the waves like dark, floating shadows of rebellion. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly between the 1650s and 1730s, wasn't the glittering, rum-soaked fantasy often painted in popular culture, but a strange mix of grit, desperation, freedom, and danger. On board a pirate ship, life was harsh and unpredictable. But for many, it was better than the grim alternatives offered by land: poverty, harsh labor, or the cruel discipline of naval service. Life aboard a pirate vessel began with a peculiar kind of democracy. Pirates, unlike the rigid chain of command found in Navy ships, voted for their captains and had the rare ability to depose them if their leadership faltered. This wasn't idealism, it was survival. A captain needed to be brave, cunning, and fair, able to command respect and ensure a fair division of plunder. That same crew who cheered when he led them into battle could also vote to maroon him on a deserted island if he hoarded gold or treated them unjustly. When a new recruit joined a pirate crew, he usually did so out of desperation or disillusionment. Some were captured sailors, given the choice between joining or dying. Others were fugitives, escaping justice, or enslaved Africans who overthrew their masters during a mutiny and chose the life of a pirate instead. The ship became a floating society, diverse and lawless in the eyes of the world, but internally governed by a code. This code varied by crew, but always laid out rules for conduct, division of spoils, and consequences for betrayal or cowardice. These codes often punished theft, desertion, or insubordination with flogging, loss of shares, or even death. Still, they offered rights that most land-based workers of the time couldn't dream of: compensation for injury, equal voting rights, and sometimes even early versions of health insurance. If a pirate lost an arm or leg, he might receive a payout from the common fund, ensuring he could still live without starving. This was a harsh world with its own brutal kind of fairness. Daily life on board was a strange rhythm of chaos and monotony. A pirate's bunk was a hammock, swaying with the motion of the ship, often wet, sometimes infested with lice or rats. Privacy didn't exist. The stench of unwashed bodies, tar, spoiled food, and gunpowder filled every breath. Meals were meager: salted meat crawling with maggots, hardtack biscuits harder than bone, and a kind of beer or watered-down rum to wash it down. Fresh water quickly turned stale, so alcohol was often safer to drink. There were no cooks with silver pots, just crew members rotating duties, scraping together whatever they had. If they had recently plundered a ship, they might feast on dried fruits, coffee, or cheese, but such luxuries never lasted. Most days were filled with the dull routines of ship life: repairing sails, swabbing decks, patching leaks, and sharpening weapons. Time blurred as the sea stretched endlessly around them, blue and unforgiving. Yet boredom could vanish in an instant. The cry of "Sail ho!" would send the crew into a frenzy, readying the cannons, loading muskets, preparing grappling hooks and boarding axes. Combat was savage and short. Pirate ships were built for speed, not strength. They relied on surprise, fear, and overwhelming force. The black flag, often marked with skulls, bones, or hourglasses, wasn't just decoration. It was psychological warfare. Many merchant ships surrendered at its sight, knowing that pirates could be merciless if resisted. When a crew boarded a ship, the violence could be brutal. cutlasses clashing, pistols flaring, screams swallowed by the roar of the ocean. But the point wasn't murder. It was treasure. Pirates preferred to take what they needed quickly, leave survivors, and escape before naval patrols could catch wind. Gold and silver were ideal, but in truth, pirates plundered anything of value: cloth, sugar, spices, tools, even books or instruments. Then they'd vanish into the waves like phantoms. And yet, they were men of contradictions. After battle, the same hands that drew blood might later dance to fiddles or dice away their spoils. Music and storytelling were sacred parts of pirate life. Every crew had its share of fiddlers, singers, and jokers. At night, under a sky littered with stars, pirates would gather to share tales, some true, most exaggerated, of monstrous sea beasts, cursed treasure, or daring escapes. These stories built camaraderie and helped pass the endless hours when no sails dotted the horizon. Though many pirates were illiterate, knowledge passed orally from mouth to mouth. Maps memorized, legends remembered, enemies marked. In the dark belly of a ship, lit only by lantern glow, they forged a culture of their own, bound not by nation or king, but by code, opportunity, and blood. This was no life of romance. It was raw, unstable, and soaked in salt and smoke. The sea showed no mercy. Sickness was a constant companion: scurvy, dysentery, fever. There were no doctors, only crude surgeons who might saw off a limb with a bottle of rum for pain relief and a heated blade to cauterize. Death was common, and graves were shallow or non-existent. Some were tossed overboard with a makeshift shroud and a few solemn words, while others vanished without ceremony, dragged down by cannon fire or tangled in rigging. Yet despite the danger, the short lives, and the slim odds of dying rich, pirate life called to many. It promised freedom, however fleeting. It rejected the order of kings and empires, offering instead a fleeting dream of choice, chaos, and plunder beneath an indifferent sky. The sound of the sea was constant, always there, a deep breathing beneath every moment, reminding the pirates that they were not entirely free, but at the mercy of a vast, uncaring ocean. The ship was alive in its own way, groaning as the timbers shifted, sails flapped, and ropes creaked with the tension of wind and weather. Every pirate, from the greenest recruit to the grizzled old hands, learned to understand the language of the ship. A sudden drop in pressure might mean a storm was coming. A strange vibration underfoot could suggest a problem in the hull. The sea was a teacher, harsh and relentless. There were no second chances when the sails tore in high winds or the mast cracked in a sudden squall. Everyone had a job, and every job mattered. Whether it was reefing sails, caulking seams, or hauling buckets of bilge water, no one was exempt. Discipline might seem loose compared to naval ships, but when the storm hit, a crew's survival depended on precision and cooperation. The daily routines aboard were strange mixtures of idleness and intensity. Some days passed in a haze of staring at the horizon, gambling, whittling bits of wood into crude figurines, or playing endless rounds of dice games. Tattoos were popular among pirates, though the ink was crude, often made from gunpowder and ash. These marks were often symbols of loyalty, superstition, or just boredom. Teeth blackened from poor diet and lack of care, and clothes were mismatched, patched, and stolen from past raids. An odd mix of tattered finery and bare necessity. Pirates often went barefoot, their feet toughened like leather. Jewelry, when worn, was rarely for decoration alone. Some pirates wore gold earrings, believing they improved eyesight, or that their value could pay for a proper burial if they died in a distant land. Superstition bled into every part of life. Whistling on a ship was bad luck, believed to summon fierce winds. A woman aboard was seen as a curse. Some pirates carried strange charms, bits of bone, carved trinkets, or sea-worn stones, as protection from the deep. The ship itself was both home and weapon. Pirate vessels weren't always massive galleons with rows of cannons. More often, they were smaller, nimble sloops or schooners, built for speed, able to dart through shallow channels or escape naval ships in open sea. These ships were often modified after capture, outfitted with more guns, reinforced decks, and hidden compartments for stashing loot. Space was always tight. Below deck, it was dark, low-ceilinged, and rank with sweat, mold, and rot. Rats thrived, and fresh air was a luxury only found above. Sleeping was in shifts, and hammocks swung so close together that pirates often knocked into each other. During rough seas, sleep was nearly impossible, as the ship pitched violently, and barrels rolled loose, clanging through the gloom. When food ran low, things turned desperate. Hardtack biscuits were often so full of weevils that pirates simply bit in and didn't bother picking them out. Salted pork or beef might have spoiled in the barrel, but hunger didn't allow for pickiness. Occasionally, fish could be caught, or turtles hunted on island shores. But when the wind died and the ship stalled in the doldrums, hunger could become dangerous. There are stories of crews resorting to cannibalism after weeks adrift, though many of these tales are whispered more than recorded. Still, the fear of starvation hung over every long voyage. Drinking water was another challenge. Stored in wooden casks, it quickly became foul, filled with algae and insects. Many pirates drank watered rum or beer to stay hydrated, which led to a constant haze of mild intoxication aboard. Discipline could be tested when too much rum flowed, and fights broke out easily, often over cheating at games, stolen food, or past grievances. Not every pirate ship was ruled with a tight grip, but chaos was never far away. When tempers flared, the results could be fatal. Knife fights in the dark, silent bodies tossed overboard, or drunken brawls that ended in broken bones were all part of life. But there were moments of strange kindness, too. Pirates looked after their own in ways few expected. Wounded crewmen were tended to as best as possible. Shares of loot were sometimes increased for the families of the dead. There was a rough kind of loyalty, born not from duty, but from shared risk. They were men who had chosen each other over the laws of nations, bound not by flags, but by mutual survival. They called each other brother, not out of affection always, but out of the understanding that no one else would stand by them when the hangman's rope waited on every shore. The sea was vast, but the world they operated in was surprisingly small. News traveled through ports and taverns, whispered by fishermen, merchants, and other sailors. When pirates reached land, usually hidden coves, uncharted islands, or sympathetic settlements, they moved fast. Supplies were restocked, deals made with corrupt officials, and stolen goods traded. Some ports, like Nassau in the Bahamas, became infamous pirate havens where crews could rest, drink, and spend their loot with wild abandon. These moments ashore were filled with indulgence. Taverns roared with music and drunken shouting. Gold was thrown around like confetti, and debts were forgotten until morning. But even in these moments of revelry, pirates watched their backs. Betrayal was common, and a drunken night could end with a knife in the ribs or a sudden arrest by a bribed magistrate. Pirate life was not meant to last. Every man aboard knew that eventually the gallows would catch up. But until then, the sea was theirs, and each day survived was a small victory against a world that had tried to chain them. The air aboard a pirate ship was thick with the mingling scents of tar, sweat, rotting wood, and the ever-present sea salt that clung to everything, from the sails to the skin of every sailor. Time passed strangely on the water. There were no clocks to chime the hours, no clear division between night and day, beyond the slow rising and falling of the sun. Pirates told time by routines, the change of watches, the meals, if they could be called that, and the slow fade of the stars before dawn. Watches were crucial to the running of the ship. The crew was divided into shifts to keep the ship moving and manned around the clock. The bell would ring in intervals to mark the passing of time, and a new group would take over duties, helming the ship, checking the rigging, or simply standing lookout at the bow, staring into the black void for the faintest flicker of sails. Silence was not common, though. The sea could be eerily still, but the ship itself was rarely quiet. Sails snapped in the wind, rigging slapped against masts. The hull groaned as it flexed and shifted. Below deck, men talked, grunted in their sleep, cursed, snored, and sometimes cried out from fevered dreams. It wasn't a place of peace, but of constant motion and tension. Many pirates suffered from lingering injuries, badly healed cuts, old bullet wounds, infected gums, or the slow decay of scurvy, which blackened the teeth and swelled the joints. They wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they had, sometimes stained and stolen, other times patched with the fine silks and satins looted from merchant ships. A pirate might wear a velvet waistcoat and a tricorn hat, yet go barefoot and stink of days-old rum and blood. Medical care, such as it was, came from the ship's barber surgeon. He was not a trained doctor in the modern sense, but someone who had seen enough wounds to know how to hack off a limb and keep the patient alive. Surgery was done with saws, knives, and fire. No anesthetic beyond a slug of rum and something to bite on. Infection was common. Leeches might be used, or poultices of herbs if any were available. Wounds festered, and men died slowly in the dark, sweating and groaning as the ship rolled endlessly on. Those who survived often did so because of sheer luck and strong constitution. When a man died, there was no cemetery, just a canvas shroud, a few solemn words, and a splash into the sea. The ocean claimed them all in the end, whether in life or death. Despite the harshness, there was a kind of order that held everything together. The pirate code wasn't a myth. It was written down, agreed upon, and enforced. Different captains had different versions, but all outlined rules for behavior, division of spoils, and consequences for breaking the code. One might say that no man could strike another without permission from the captain. Another might forbid gambling during watches. Stealing from the common pot was a serious offense, often punished with whipping or even marooning. Being left alone on an island with nothing but a pistol and a single shot, as a twisted act of mercy. But the code also protected. It guaranteed each man a vote, a share, and sometimes even compensation if he was injured in the line of duty. It gave structure to the chaos, something that made the pirate ship feel less like a mob and more like a strange, self-governed society. The threat of battle always loomed on the horizon. Pirates didn't set sail just to drift. They hunted. A lookout perched high in the crow's nest scanned the endless blue for sails. When one was spotted, the entire ship transformed. Men rushed to their posts, cannons were readied, powder kegs opened, muskets and pistols checked. Grappling hooks were coiled and axes sharpened. The captain would decide how to approach, sometimes with stealth, using the wind and sun to blind the enemy, sometimes with intimidation, flying the dreaded black flag and firing warning shots. A captured merchant ship could offer enormous prizes: gold, spices, textiles, fine tools, and liquor, but also danger. Some crews resisted. Then the pirates became boarders, leaping onto enemy decks in a roar of chaos, gunfire, and steel. Victory was fast and savage. Defeat meant death or worse. After a successful raid, the spoils were divided according to the code. The captain and quartermaster received larger shares, but every man got something. There were arguments, always. Who had killed whom? Who had found the coin purse? Who had carried the wounded? These were settled with shouting, threats, and sometimes knives, but usually under the watchful eye of the quartermaster, second only to the captain in authority. Once the shares were handed out, the pirates celebrated. Rum flowed freely, songs rose into the sky, and for a moment, the sea seemed less cruel. It was during these times that bonds were forged. In the glow of lantern light, men shared tales, jokes, and curses. They tattooed each other, gambled, and sometimes wept. The life they lived was hard, brutal, and likely short. But for many, it was the freest they'd ever known. They were fugitives, yes, branded criminals by every navy, hunted by the world's powers. But they were also outcasts who had chosen a life where they answered to no king, no law, and no god but the sea itself. The horizon was both a boundary and a promise. Every new sail spotted could be a fortune or doom. Every storm cloud could bring disaster or salvation. Yet still they sailed, not because they were mad or evil, but because something in them refused to be tamed. There was a rhythm to pirate life, one that pulsed through the boards of the ship and into the bones of the men aboard. It was a life defined not by clocks, but by movement, the rise and fall of tides, the curve of the moon, the creaking sway of the mast. Every action on board was shaped by nature's unpredictable mood. When the sea was calm, the ship glided smoothly, and the crew might relax a little. They'd repair sails, scrub the deck with buckets of seawater and sand, or sit in the shade of the mainsail, smoking pipes, carving wood, or spinning lies about buried treasure. But when the wind shifted, when storm clouds boiled on the horizon, or a sudden squall screamed down from the sky, every man snapped into action like part of a living machine. There was no room for hesitation. Ropes had to be pulled, sails reefed, cannon secured, all while the deck pitched and waves crashed over the railings with bone-chilling force. Storms at sea were unlike anything most land dwellers could imagine. A ship caught in a gale could vanish in moments. Lightning turned night into brief flashes of silver and black. Thunder cracked like the sky itself was tearing, and the rain came sideways, blinding and stinging like needles. Water poured into the hull. Barrels broke free and tumbled like battering rams, and sailors clung to anything they could as the wind tried to tear them from the deck. Some screamed prayers. Others just worked with grim determination, knowing there was no land in sight, no help on the way. If the ship survived, it might take days to recover. Masts splintered, sails shredded, crew injured or washed overboard. Those lost to the sea were rarely spoken of again. Their names joined a long list of the vanished, swallowed by the water, and remembered only when their bunk stayed empty at night. Between storms and raids, pirates hunted for ports, not the well-guarded harbors of European colonies, but the hidden coves, outlaw settlements, and secret beaches known only to men who had lived on the sea for years. These places were lifelines. Here, a crew could mend their ship, patch wounds, refill their casks with water, and restock gunpowder, food, and rum. Some of these outposts were run by former pirates, now too old or too smart to stay at sea. They sold supplies at a high price, took their cut from any plunder brought in, and provided shelter for a while. A few even had deals with corrupt colonial officials, trading bribes for protection and turning a blind eye to who came and went. These towns were wild, lawless, and dangerous in their own right. Fights broke out in taverns, knives flashed over unpaid debts, and alliances shifted with the tides. But for a pirate, they were safer than open water. While ashore, pirates often spent their gold with reckless speed. Months of deprivation and danger gave way to sudden excess, drinking until they collapsed, gambling until they were penniless, and indulging in every vice they dreamed about at sea. It wasn't just pleasure. It was survival, in a way. Most pirates didn't expect to live long. Better to die broke but satisfied than hoard treasure they might never enjoy. And so they danced, brawled, drank, and laughed in candle-lit taverns with warped floors and thatched roofs, while the rain fell outside and the ocean waited like a patient predator. Sometimes they met lovers, or left behind children they'd never meet again. Sometimes they got sick and never recovered. But for those nights on land, they were kings, untouchable, basking in their brief freedom before the sea called them back. The fear of betrayal was ever present. Informants, bounty hunters, and imperial spies lurked in every port. Pirates traveled under false names, swapped flags, and sometimes posed as merchants to avoid capture. But the noose hung in the background of every tale. If caught, a pirate could expect little mercy. Trials were often quick and heavily stacked against them. Witnesses were bribed or frightened into silence, and the accused rarely had a proper defense. In many cases, pirates were tried en masse, and those who were recognized as captains or particularly brutal were hanged first, their bodies left on display in cages as a warning. The rest might be sent to the gallows or to labor in chains on sugar plantations, a fate some considered worse than death. Even the luckiest who escaped justice lived with the constant knowledge that one wrong move, one loose word, could end it all. To protect themselves, some pirate crews practiced clever deception. They flew false flags, posing as Spanish, French, or even naval ships until they were close enough to strike. They forged documents, used stolen uniforms, and spread false rumors to throw off their enemies. Some ships were painted to mimic popular merchant designs, so they could sneak into convoys unnoticed. Others sailed under neutral colors and kept their black flags hidden until it was too late. Information was power. Pirates bribed port officials, tavern owners, and dock workers to learn which ships were leaving port, where they were bound, and what cargo they carried. A single tip could lead to a massive haul, or to a deadly ambush if the information was a trap. Trust was rare. Loyalty was earned only after blood was spilled together. And even then, it was fragile. Despite all this, pirates found strange moments of peace. Watching the sun rise over a mirror-flat sea, listening to the soft slap of waves against the hull at night, sharing quiet stories in the dim light of an oil lamp. Even in a life defined by violence, theft, and flight, they carved out small spaces where the world felt still. Some sketched crude maps, hoping to find or create their own island paradise. Others wrote journals, though most couldn't read, simply scratching out marks that meant something only to them. They wondered about their families left behind, the homes they'd fled or been torn from, the lives they might have lived, had fate bent another way. And in those moments, beneath stars brighter than anything seen on land, they knew they were outsiders, creatures of the sea, untethered and unforgiven. Yet they sailed on, drawn ever forward by wind, water, and the thin thread of hope that something better waited just beyond the next wave. The ship was never still, even when the sea seemed calm. It rolled gently, a ceaseless motion that worked its way into every limb and thought, until the pirates aboard felt more at home on shifting planks than solid earth. Some men grew so accustomed to the movement that land made them dizzy, their legs unsure and clumsy on firm ground. Aboard the ship, though, they moved with an instinctive grace, ducking beneath low beams, swinging from ropes, adjusting to the tilt of the deck without thinking. They became part of the vessel itself, hardened by routine and sea air. Everything they owned could fit into a small chest or sack. A few coins, a knife or pistol, a bit of spare cloth, maybe a trinket from home, or a souvenir taken from a plundered ship. They learned not to be sentimental. The ocean had no mercy for men who clung too tightly to the past. There were few luxuries. Mirrors rare, and most pirates went weeks without seeing their own reflection. When they did, they barely recognized the salt-streaked, sun-scorched, bearded faces that stared back. Shaving was optional, bathing a distant memory. Clothes were whatever could be taken or salvaged, patched over and over again. Boots were precious and usually worn only in battle or while ashore. Bare feet gripped the slick wood of the deck better anyway. Jewelry, when worn, wasn't just for show. It was portable wealth. A gold ring or silver chain might be useful for trade or bribery, or even serve as proof of identity. Some wore beads, bones, or charms that had personal meaning, or were believed to ward off misfortune. Appearance mattered less than strength, skill, and reliability. A pirate's worth was measured in what he could do when the cannon fired, or the sails needed reefing in a storm. Weapons were part of daily attire. Most pirates carried at least one blade, a cutlass, dagger, or boarding axe tucked into a sash. Pistols were common, but they were unreliable, slow to reload, and often more useful as clubs after firing once. Gunpowder was precious and had to be kept dry, stored in small flasks or horns. Pirates practiced with their weapons, but there wasn't much ceremony to it. They fought dirty and fast, using whatever was at hand. A rope, a splintered board, a mug of hot tar. Anything could be a weapon if it gave the edge. Fights on deck were chaotic, with no room for elegant duels or drawn-out combat. The goal was to disable, disarm, or kill quickly. Mercy was rare, but sometimes given, especially if the enemy crew surrendered before blood was spilled. Captains who resisted were often killed, but valuable passengers or skilled sailors might be spared and offered a place on the pirate crew, depending on their usefulness and loyalty. Life was not only about raiding and fighting, though. Much of the time was spent waiting. Weeks might pass without sight of another ship. The horizon was endless, the days hot and slow, the nights full of stars and silence. Pirates passed the time however they could. They told stories, some true, some wildly exaggerated. They gambled with dice or cards, using buttons, scraps, or promises as stakes when coins were scarce. They played music on fiddles, flutes, or makeshift drums, sang bawdy songs, and danced clumsily on the deck. Laughter was rough and often cruel, but it was a defense against fear and boredom. Friendships formed in strange ways, shared rum, mutual scars, or surviving the same raid. There were rivalries too, bitter grudges that simmered beneath the surface until they exploded in fists or knives. The quartermaster kept the peace when the captain was focused on strategy or navigation. But justice was often swift and rough. Supplies were a constant concern. Food had to last, and the sea gave little. Fishing was unreliable, and though they sometimes caught dolphins or hauled in netfuls of small fish, the bulk of their meals came from salted meat, dry biscuits, and whatever they could steal. Fresh fruit and vegetables were treasures, hoarded to prevent scurvy. When they found coconuts or bananas on island stops, they devoured them greedily. Drinking water was always at risk of spoiling, so barrels were inspected daily. If water turned foul, they strained it through cloth or mixed it with rum to make it tolerable. Illness spread fast. With so many men in close quarters, a single fever could sweep through the ship in days. Some pirates survived plague and pox, while others died quietly in their hammocks, their bodies tossed into the sea with little ceremony. There were superstitions for everything. Some pirates refused to cut their hair or nails at sea. Others never spoke certain words or avoided whistling, afraid it would summon storms. Black cats were considered lucky, but only if they boarded of their own accord. Birds were omens too. Albatrosses were sacred. Killing one was believed to curse the whole crew. Sharks trailing the ship meant death was near. Some pirates swore by charms, tattoos, or talismans taken from strange lands. These beliefs, while strange to outsiders, helped them cope with the fear that always lingered beneath the surface. For all their bravado, pirates were not fearless. They knew too well how fragile their lives were, how easily a rope could snap, a cannon misfire, or a storm rise from nowhere. In this world of salt and steel, the line between survival and disaster was razor thin. Yet for all its brutality, many pirates would never trade it for a more civilized life. On land, they were poor, powerless, and punished. At sea, they were free to fight, to choose, to take what they could. It was not an easy life, but it was theirs. And as the ship rocked gently in the moonlight, sails full and the wind humming low like a lullaby, they slept knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, bound by code, coin, and the endless, ever-hungry sea. The sky above the open sea was a world of its own, ever-changing and full of subtle signs that only the experienced could read. Pirates learned to read the clouds, to watch the shifting color of the horizon, to smell the sharpness of incoming rain, or hear the low thunder of distant surf warning of unseen shores. They became attuned to the moods of nature in ways no land-bound man could understand. When the sky turned a sickly yellow, or the wind fell deathly still, the older hands muttered and made signs with their fingers, for they knew what often came next. A tempest, the kind that could snap masts and drown a crew before they had time to pray. But between those violent moments, the sea could stretch endlessly in golden silence, the surface calm and shining like polished glass, broken only by the flick of flying fish or the distant trail of a whale's back rising like a dark island before slipping away into the deep. The ocean, for all its beauty, held secrets darker than any storm. Ships disappeared without a trace. Strange lights were seen at night, hovering above the waves. Some swore they saw ghost ships, abandoned vessels still drifting, sails torn, their crews long dead or vanished. There were whispered tales of cursed treasures that brought madness to those who touched them, of monstrous beasts with eyes like lanterns that followed ships from beneath. These stories were told in low voices around lanterns, not because the men believed every word, but because they understood that the sea didn't play by any known rules. A man could be alive and strong one morning, and gone without a sound by sunset. Superstition filled the gaps that reason couldn't. So they knocked on wood, avoided certain numbers, and never spoke the names of the drowned. It was better not to tempt the sea. Work never truly ended aboard a pirate ship. Even during the long stretches without battle or storm, the ship demanded care. Wood had to be scrubbed and tarred to protect against rot. Sails had to be patched and reinforced. The rigging needed constant inspection. Cannon had to be cleaned, their wheels greased, their barrels polished, even if no enemy ship had been seen for weeks. Powder was checked daily, kept dry and safe, because a single wet keg could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Every pirate was expected to know the ship as intimately as his own hands. In emergencies, there was no time to hesitate. Each man had a post, a duty, a task to perform without orders. It wasn't about pride. It was survival. There were moments of pride, though. When a ship was taken and the enemy surrendered without bloodshed, the crew felt a surge of triumph, not just for the gold, but for the reputation. Word traveled fast among sailors. A notorious crew could inspire terror before their flag even appeared. Pirates used fear as a tool. Some carved gruesome images into their weapons or painted their faces before battle to unnerve their foes. Others invented terrifying names for their ships, like the Vengeance, the Devil's Tooth, or the Widowmaker. Their flags, often designed by the crew, bore symbols of death: skulls, skeletons, hourglasses, and bleeding hearts. These weren't just decorations. They were warnings. Surrender and live. Resist and be destroyed. Yet reputation had a cost. The more feared a pirate became, the more attention he attracted from navies and bounty hunters. The Golden Age of Piracy wasn't golden for long. Governments, tired of their merchants being plundered and their authority mocked, began to respond with overwhelming force. Warships with dozens of guns scoured the waters, and no port was truly safe anymore. Once friendly governors were replaced by hard men, with orders to hang pirates by the dozen. Royal pardons were offered to those who turned in their comrades, sowing distrust among crews. The sea, once a refuge, became a tightening noose. Every sail spotted on the horizon had to be judged, friend or foe, merchant or man of war. Mistakes were costly. Still, the pirates endured. They adapted, they shifted their routes, struck in unexpected places, and grew bolder. Some sailed as far as West Africa or the Indian Ocean, chasing richer prizes and outrunning the reach of European powers. Others tried to carve out safe havens, hidden islands, fortified coves, even short-lived pirate republics where no flag flew but their own. These attempts rarely lasted. Eventually, the crown or the company found them. Cannons roared and bodies swayed from gibbets as warnings. But for a brief time, these pirates lived on their own terms. They created communities without kings, where decisions were made by vote, where a man's worth was not his birth, but his courage and skill. They weren't perfect. They were violent, often cruel, and not heroes by any stretch. But they were something different in a world ruled by empire and coin. On quiet nights, when the sea was black as ink and the stars glittered like shattered glass, pirates would stare into the void and wonder how much longer their luck would hold. They knew their lives were borrowed. No man could outrun the hangman forever. But they also knew that while they lived, they were free in a way few could understand. They had no masters, no borders, no laws but their own. They had chosen a life of danger and were prepared to pay the price. And as the ship rocked gently and the sails rustled like whispers in the wind, some smiled in their sleep, dreaming not of riches or safety, but simply of another sunrise at sea. When pirates captured a ship, the plunder wasn't always what they expected. Gold and silver were rare compared to what most merchant vessels actually carried. Barrels of salted fish, tobacco leaves, casks of molasses, crates of textiles, iron tools, livestock, dried beans, or barrels of pitch and tar. Sometimes they found passengers, merchants, missionaries, women and children, or government officials. These encounters brought their own complications. The captives might be ransomed if they were important enough, or pressed into service if they had useful skills. A surgeon, a blacksmith, a navigator. These were worth far more than any trinket. But other passengers might be left behind, marooned or set adrift, depending on the crew's mood and code. There was no universal pirate law about what to do with prisoners. Some captains were relatively merciful. Others, paranoid about being identified later, made sure no witnesses ever left alive. Once the loot was divided and the prize ship stripped, the question became whether to sink it, burn it, or keep it. If the captured vessel was faster or better armed than the pirate's own ship, they might transfer everything over and adopt the new ship as their flagship, giving it a fresh name and sometimes repainting it entirely. If not, they might use it to confuse pursuers, sending the decoy ship off in another direction while they slipped away unnoticed. In rare cases, they kept the captured ship as part of a small pirate fleet, though managing more than one vessel increased the chance of betrayal or chaos. These floating crews were bound together by opportunity more than trust, and splitting power between multiple ships often led to arguments, backstabbing, and sudden mutinies. Mutiny was not uncommon. The pirate myth often overlooks how fragile leadership could be. Captains walked a thin line. They needed to be daring enough to inspire confidence, but not so reckless they got everyone killed. They had to share plunder fairly and show respect to the crew, or risk being voted out. Or worse, some captains were dethroned peacefully and left behind at the nearest island. Others weren't so lucky. Discontent brewed quietly, especially when raids failed, or when discipline became too harsh. A failed mutiny might end in blood. A successful one meant a new leader, and sometimes a new direction for the ship entirely. Pirates were not above rebranding themselves, hoisting different flags, adopting new names, even faking their own deaths to escape reputations that had grown too dangerous. Not every pirate was a brute. Many were surprisingly well-read. Books were valued prizes when found in merchant ships, and certain pirates kept journals or collected maps and navigational charts. Some even had a taste for poetry or stories from distant lands. Literacy wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. A ship's navigator, in particular, had to be familiar with charts, stars, and currents. Knowing how to use a sextant or read a compass could make or break a voyage. Pirates who understood navigation were prized and rarely harmed in battle. Even illiterate pirates learned from experience which islands had fresh water, which ports were corrupt enough to trade with, where the Spanish gold convoys usually sailed, and how to use the winds to outmaneuver slower vessels. Their education came not from books, but from survival. Pirates sometimes formed temporary alliances with local powers, native tribes, runaway slaves, or smugglers who knew the land better than any chart. In the swamps and hidden rivers of the Americas, these contacts helped pirates escape patrols or hide for weeks at a time. Some pirates even married into these communities, disappearing into the jungle or the mountains when the sea became too dangerous. These cross-cultural exchanges were rarely recorded in detail, but they shaped the pirate world in subtle ways. New words, new foods, new beliefs. A few pirates even converted religions or adopted local customs as a way to protect themselves or blend in. The image of the white, European pirate was far too narrow. Crews were often mixed: Englishmen, Africans, Arabs, freed slaves, French deserters, and Caribbean-born seamen working side by side. What united them wasn't nationality, but necessity. Religious life aboard a pirate ship was deeply personal and often contradictory. Pirates swore, drank, and violated nearly every commandment of conventional religion, but many still carried charms, crosses, or small relics for protection. Some prayed before battle. Others made pacts or oaths to gods or saints, promising offerings in exchange for safe passage. Pirates had little patience for priests unless they brought valuables, but even the most hardened men sometimes made time for ritual. The sea had a way of humbling even the most blasphemous soul. Shipwrecks were common, and many pirates died in ways that left their bodies unrecoverable. A prayer or a final word spoken to the waves was often the only burial a man received. Pirate justice was swift and tailored to the environment. A man caught stealing from the communal stores might be whipped, forced to go without food for a day, or have his ear sliced off. More serious crimes, like betrayal or attempted murder, could result in marooning or execution. But the methods weren't always bloody. Some captains used isolation as punishment, locking a man below deck for days with nothing but hardtack and water. Others tied offenders to the mast during storms, forcing them to endure hours of battering rain and cold. On occasion, mock trials were held, with the crew acting as judge and jury, shouting out verdicts while waving mugs of rum. The accused had little chance to argue. The process gave the illusion of fairness. The real purpose was to maintain order through spectacle, to remind everyone what happened to those who crossed the line. Ships weren't just places of violence and punishment. They were also stages for wild creativity. Pirates carved intricate designs into wood beams, stitched elaborate patterns into their clothes, and made music using whatever they could find. A few carried exotic instruments taken from faraway lands, drums, pipes, even small stringed instruments brought back from the East. Singing was constant, whether during work or at rest. Sea shanties weren't just for morale. They kept time for group labor, like hauling ropes or rowing longboats. The lyrics were often vulgar or humorous, filled with exaggeration, and changed depending on the crew's mood. These songs, passed from ship to ship, became the oral history of the pirate world, filled with names, battles, and cautionary tales. They were the voice of men who knew they might not survive to tell their stories any other way. A pirate's relationship with the open sea was both sacred and brutal. It offered them escape, adventure, and riches, but it also tested them constantly. Navigation was a high-stakes game of intuition, skill, and luck. Without the tools of modern science, pirates relied on stars, wind, water currents, and instinct. The sun and stars served as their compass, but cloudy skies could steal their direction. Currents could drag them miles off course, and uncharted reefs or sandbars could tear open the hull without warning. Maps were often outdated, incomplete, or deliberately false, copied from stolen books, or passed between sailors like smuggled treasure. Some pirates carried their own handmade charts, covered in scribbled notes, symbols, and warnings. These personal maps were guarded with the same care as gold, because they could mean the difference between a swift raid and a fatal wreck. Ship maintenance was a never-ending burden. Barnacles, seaweed, and rot threatened the hull from beneath, slowing the vessel and making it vulnerable. Every so often, the ship would have to be careened, a process where it was intentionally grounded on a beach and tilted to one side so the crew could scrape off growth, patch cracks, and reinforce seams with tar and pitch. This was grueling, dangerous work. It left the ship exposed for days, helpless if enemies discovered them. But it was necessary. A ship slowed by barnacles or weakened by leaks would never escape a naval patrol or catch a fleeing merchant. The process of careening brought out the worst in tempers. Men toiled in the sun, waist-deep in foul-smelling sludge, swatting flies and dealing with tools that constantly broke or vanished. But once complete, the ship felt faster, sharper, like a blade freshly honed and ready for its next kill. The pirates' enemies were many, and growing by the year. Naval ships prowled the sea with orders to hunt down and eliminate pirate vessels, backed by increasingly aggressive governments and trading companies. These ships were better armed, more disciplined, and often commanded by ambitious officers eager to prove themselves. When pirates spotted one of these vessels on the horizon, panic often followed. A naval warship might carry 30 or more cannons, while a pirate ship might only have a dozen, and far less powder. Naval crews drilled constantly, fired in organized broadsides, and kept detailed logs of pirate sightings. Pirates, in contrast, relied on surprise, chaos, and speed. If caught in open waters by a Navy ship, there were only 3 options: run, fight, or surrender. And surrender usually ended in chains or a noose. Pirates adapted by becoming masters of disguise and escape. They learned to read the shape of sails at a great distance, to spot whether a ship was likely friendly, neutral, or deadly. They sailed at odd hours, used inlets and reefs that only locals knew, and sometimes slipped away under cover of storms. Some went further, falsifying documents, creating entirely fake identities, or using painted ships to resemble known merchant vessels. Flags were swapped often. A pirate ship might sail under the British flag in the morning, switch to the Spanish flag at dusk, and raise the Jolly Roger only at the moment of attack. Even pirate crews had to be ready to act like ordinary sailors at a moment's notice, hiding weapons and faking civilian behavior in case a patrol ship appeared suddenly. These charades were dangerous games, and one slip of the tongue could lead to disaster. Occasionally, pirates received help from the very officials who were supposed to hunt them. Corruption was rampant in the colonies, where governors, harbor masters, and tax collectors often turned a blind eye in exchange for a cut of the profits. A pirate might sail into a small colonial town and, instead of being arrested, be quietly welcomed by merchants, eager for cheap goods, local officials needing favors, or innkeepers hungry for business. These backroom deals helped pirates refit their ships, sell stolen cargo, or learn the movements of merchant convoys. It wasn't loyalty that kept these relationships alive. It was greed. But trust was always fragile. If a governor was replaced, or if London applied pressure, those same welcoming hands might suddenly reach for chains instead. Many pirates learned the hard way that a handshake on land meant little once your gold ran dry. Rum played a strange role in pirate culture. It was everywhere, used to toast before battle, passed around during celebrations, mixed with water to stretch supplies, and poured onto wounds when no other medicine could be found. It dulled pain, lifted spirits, and started more than a few fights. Drunkenness wasn't encouraged during work, but during downtime, it became part of the atmosphere. A barrel of rum was often worth more than gold in keeping morale high. But it was also a source of conflict. Pirates fought over rationing, snuck extra swigs when they thought no one was watching, and sometimes drank themselves into stupors that made them useless in battle. A captain had to be firm, but not cruel, discipline the drunkards without creating mutiny, and reward loyalty without letting chaos take hold. Rum was celebration, but also risk. One of the most dangerous moments for any pirate crew was not during the heat of battle, but in the lull afterward, when the spoils were counted. Dividing loot was a tense affair. Each man had expectations. He wanted his share, and he wanted it fairly. The pirate code usually specified how treasure would be split. The captain and quartermaster took larger portions. Skilled crewmen like carpenters or surgeons got a bonus, and the rest was divided evenly among the others. But if the prize was smaller than expected, or if someone felt cheated, arguments erupted. In some cases, violence followed. Knives were drawn, pistols waved, threats exchanged. The quartermaster played a crucial role here, acting as the enforcer of fairness, the voice of the crew, and the one man who could stand up to the captain without immediate backlash. A good quartermaster kept the peace. A bad one didn't last long. Sometimes pirates tried to disappear altogether, to vanish into the colonies, change names, and live out their days quietly. A few succeeded. They used their shares to buy land, open taverns, or start families. They posed as retired sailors, forged papers, or bribed local officials to ignore their past. But even in hiding, they lived with the constant risk of being recognized. A merchant they once robbed, a sailor they spared, or even a former crewmate could appear and ruin everything. And for every pirate who managed to slip away, there were dozens who were caught, dragged back to the gallows, and hanged in front of jeering crowds. Their bodies were sometimes left to rot in public squares, or dangled in iron cages over harbor entrances as a gruesome warning to others. It was a violent end, but pirates had made their peace with that long before they raised the black flag. Despite the harshness and the fleeting nature of pirate life, there were strange moments of tenderness and humanity that emerged between the cracks of violence. On long voyages with nothing but the sea and sky, pirates formed makeshift families. Bonds forged in shared suffering became unspoken pacts. Men who would die for each other, not out of loyalty to a flag, but because they'd survived the same storms, buried the same friends, and stared death in the face together. Some took on roles that went beyond duty. An older sailor might act like a father to younger ones, guiding them through the ropes and the customs. Friendships between crewmates could grow so deep they were buried side by side, with tokens passed from hand to hand, tiny keepsakes of a world that had no time for mourning. Pirates might not have spoken the language of softness, but their camaraderie was a lifeline as much as any rope or compass. There were few women aboard pirate ships, but not none. The most famous were those who took up arms themselves: Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and others who disguised themselves as men, or lived openly as fighters alongside their male counterparts. These women were not mascots or exceptions. They were pirates in every sense, respected by crews that valued ferocity and loyalty more than gender. Some worked harder than any man to earn that respect, cutting down enemies in battle, handling sails in storms, and enduring every hardship the sea offered. Other women appeared in different roles: captives turned traders, informants, smugglers, or lovers who became part of the floating underworld that stretched between ships and port towns. The idea of piracy as a purely male domain was a convenient simplification. In truth, it was a world of outcasts and survivors, and the sea didn't care who you were if you could fight, sail, or survive. The Golden Age of Piracy also carried with it a hidden network of trade. Not just goods and gold, but stories, news, songs, rumors, and knowledge. Pirates often knew about major political shifts long before the newspapers printed them. They carried tales of revolutions, royal marriages and mutinies, of governors overthrown, and colonies on the brink of collapse. They heard whispers of buried treasure, cursed islands, ships that vanish near Cuba, strange lights near Madagascar, or giant squid off the coast of India. These stories passed from ship to ship in taverns and hidden coves, distorted and embellished, but sometimes containing grains of truth. A good storyteller could hold a crew's attention for hours, spinning yarns about sea monsters or ghost ships that floated through fog, their sails tattered and crew silent, eyes glowing like candles. Entertainment aboard a ship didn't only come from songs or gambling. Pirates also staged crude performances. A few had acting experience from their lives before the sea, or had seen plays in coastal cities, and remembered enough to imitate them. Using spare cloth as costumes, and whatever props they could find, pirates would act out ridiculous scenes, sometimes parodying colonial governors, enemy captains, or naval officers in satirical skits. Laughter echoed over the waves, relieving boredom and building morale. Humor was often sharp and dark. Jokes about executions, diseases, or recent raids. But in their own way, these performances were a rebellion. They mocked the world that had cast them out, gave voice to their rage and joy, and reminded each other that they were still alive, still human, even if the world preferred to call them monsters. The deeper they sailed into remote waters, the more the pirates encountered strange and unfamiliar worlds. Tropical islands covered in dense jungle, massive rivers snaking inland through unmapped terrain, beaches littered with bones of wrecked ships. On some islands, they found native peoples who traded willingly, offering food, water, and local knowledge in exchange for tools, cloth, or firearms. On others, they met resistance and were forced to flee under a hail of spears and arrows. Some pirates vanished into these lands, choosing to live out their days in hidden villages far from colonial rule. Others raided settlements for supplies, leaving trails of destruction. The interaction between pirates and native populations was complicated and often brutal, but it was also a reminder that the world was far bigger than the empires that claimed to rule it. There were places where the king's writ meant nothing, where survival depended on more than just firepower. Illness remained a constant threat. Beyond scurvy and fevers, pirates suffered from ailments modern medicine hadn't yet named. Strange tropical diseases that rotted skin, worms that grew inside flesh, infections that turned limbs black. The crew might wake to find a man screaming, his body covered in boils, or shaking uncontrollably with fever. There were no doctors, only what little knowledge passed from sailor to sailor. Herbs boiled into teas, strange roots chewed to numb pain, sea sponges soaked in rum and wrapped around wounds. A few ships carried a doctor, usually a former apprentice or a fraud who could read Latin and had stolen a medical book. But when death came, it came quietly, often at night. The body would be sewn into a hammock with a cannonball at the feet, and the last stitch passed through the nose to ensure the man was truly dead. Then came the final splash, and the sea would take him, without stone, sermon, or name. Treasure, for all the legends, was often more burden than prize. Gold was heavy, hard to spend without suspicion, and dangerous to carry for long. Many pirates preferred practical loot: spices, tools, sugar, cloth, food, and powder. These could be traded quickly and without question. But still, there were tales of hidden stashes buried on islands, maps drawn in blood, and secret codes scratched into the backs of spoons or the folds of clothing. Some pirates believed in these stories with religious fervor, dedicating years of their lives to chasing treasure that may never have existed. Others played along, inventing tales to keep their crews dreaming and loyal. And occasionally, a chest would really be found, full of coin or jewels, brought up from the sand, proof that sometimes myth and reality danced too close to tell apart. When it happened, the ship would erupt in celebration, and for a night, every man aboard felt invincible. But always, the sea waited. It didn't care about dreams or gold. It would take them all eventually, chest and bone alike. Some of the most cunning pirates were not the loudest or the most violent, but the ones who understood trade, leverage, and language. Among the crew, a man who spoke multiple tongues, Spanish, Dutch, French, Portuguese, was worth more than an extra sword. These interpreters could negotiate with local traders, bribe foreign captains, or eavesdrop on enemy plans. They could decode intercepted letters, sweet-talk their way into restricted harbors, or lie convincingly enough to pass the entire crew off as shipwrecked fishermen. These pirates didn't just survive on brutality, they thrived on manipulation. Deals were made in back rooms of island taverns, in broken combinations of half a dozen languages, using gestures, gold coins, or threats. A single sentence misunderstood could spark a massacre or save the whole ship. Clothing, though often ragged and mismatched, still became a form of identity among pirates. Some favored bright colors stolen from merchant cargo, scarlet waistcoats, emerald sashes, fine silk scarves fluttering in the wind. Others wore bits of armor or military jackets taken from defeated naval officers, sometimes even decorating themselves with stolen medals and epaulettes as mocking trophies. Hats were almost sacred, wide-brimmed monstrosities decorated with feathers, shells, or bones. Every outfit told a story of past raids, ships taken, cities burned, and men killed. The more daring pirates made themselves into walking legends with their appearance alone. A striking figure stepping off a longboat onto a dock could turn heads and make port guards hesitate, unsure whether to attack, salute, or run. It was all theater, but pirates understood that image was power, especially when it traveled faster than cannon fire. In the dense, fetid atmosphere of the lower decks, life could be miserable. The hold was dark, damp, and crawling with rats. Hammocks hung between beams, swinging with the movement of the ship, soaked from sweat, seawater, and the humidity that never fully left. Men slept in shifts. Privacy didn't exist. Conversations, snores, coughs, and arguments echoed through the cramped space, mixing with the scent of mildew, smoke, and human closeness. Yet these spaces also held laughter, whispered secrets, and the closest thing to comfort many pirates ever knew. A shared flask, a dirty joke, or a quietly hummed song in the dark could carry a man through weeks without sunlight. When storms howled or cannonballs tore through the planks above, men clung to the familiar creak of those beams, hoping the walls wouldn't collapse inward like a coffin snapping shut. Relationships with local islanders and port communities were more complex than just trade and theft. Pirates occasionally built entire settlements, crude wooden villages hidden deep in mangrove swamps or tucked behind cliffs where few ships could follow. These secret harbors became places of rest, barter, and hiding. Women and children lived there too, along with retired pirates, escaped slaves, and outlaws of every kind. Some grew crops, raised animals, and created temporary peace in a world built on plunder. There were crude rules. No fighting near the water barrels, no stealing from the communal stockpile, no bringing enemies to the gate. But these rules were enforced by men who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. The most successful settlements were those that remained invisible, known only to a few trusted captains, marked on no maps, and whispered of in legends that blurred truth and invention. While at sea, pirates marked the passing of time, not by calendars, but by seasons and stars. They knew when the winds shifted for the monsoons, when hurricane season began, and when the trade routes would be busiest. They counted time by the number of ships captured, the number of days since land, or by personal milestones, like the day a man lost a finger in a boarding fight, or the week they ran out of tobacco. Some scratched marks into the mast, kept knots in a rope, or simply remembered by heart. Birthdays were rarely celebrated. Age blurred. A boy might look 20 and claim to be 30. An old sailor might forget his homeland entirely. Life at sea wore down the details. All that mattered was the now. The next wind, the next raid, the next survival. Ships often carried more than human cargo. Cats and dogs were common aboard, kept to control rats, or simply for companionship. Some crews adopted monkeys, parrots, or other exotic animals taken from distant ports. These creatures became mascots, morale boosters, or distractions. A colorful parrot might become a crew favorite, mimicking curse words and earning better food than the cook. A loyal dog might guard the captain's quarters. Even the meanest pirate could be seen feeding scraps to a mangy cat, laughing when it scratched someone who got too close. These animals offered something innocent, unburdened by betrayal or bloodshed. In a life so full of loss, they were rare constants, alive, warm, and small enough to survive storms by curling into the crook of a sleeping pirate's arm. But not every day was fire and steel. Some mornings passed with nothing but the sound of creaking wood and the sigh of sails. Pirates sat in silence, sharpening knives, cleaning pistols, fixing gear. A man might take an hour to fix a tear in his coat or carve a small figure from driftwood. Someone might fish lazily over the side, hoping for something fresh. Others wrote letters they'd never send, to families they hadn't seen in years, or sweethearts who had probably moved on. These moments didn't make it into the songs or the stories, but they were real. The quiet days, the empty horizon, the wind in the rigging, the gulls circling above, were sometimes harder to bear than the battles. Because it was in silence that the fear crept in, whispering about the next raid, the next betrayal, the next grave beneath the waves. And through it all, the sea rolled on, endless, indifferent, untamable. It was both cradle and grave, lover and executioner. The pirates understood this better than anyone. They didn't expect peace. They didn't expect justice. They didn't expect to die in bed, old and safe. But for as long as the sails filled and the stars led them forward, they lived without chains, in defiance of kings and courts. And that freedom, however brief, was worth every storm, every scar, and every desperate chase into the unknown. As pirates aged, those who survived began to carry the wear of the sea in their bones. Sun-leathered skin, hands gnarled from rope burns and blade fights, eyes that squinted even at night, and backs that ached with every tilt of the deck. Some grew bitter and quiet, more dangerous than ever, while others turned to storytelling, spinning tales so outrageous the young couldn't tell if they were truth or madness. These older pirates often became unofficial mentors, teaching knot-tying techniques, trick moves in close combat, or the places on a ship where you could sleep undisturbed. But many feared growing old. At sea, age was weakness. A man too slow to climb the rigging, too frail to swing a sword, might be left behind, or gently encouraged to take a shore job that didn't exist. There was no pension, no ceremony. The sea gave no medals. Sometimes old pirates simply walked off into the jungle of some nameless island, carrying their cutlass and a bottle, and were never seen again. Pirates had a different sense of honor, one based not on nobility or reputation, but on use and intent. Betrayal was despised more than cowardice. A man who ran from a fight might be mocked, But one who stole from his own crew could be killed without trial. Yet they also understood necessity. Lies told to an enemy, bribes to a port official, tricks used in negotiations. These weren't moral failings. They were tools of survival. To be a pirate was to exist in the space between civilization and chaos, bending rules to the breaking point, but never shattering your own. That was what made pirate codes so strange and fierce. They weren't made for justice. They were made to keep a crew from turning inward and destroying itself. As long as every man had a share, a vote, and a voice, they could endure anything. But when fairness cracked, everything else followed. Sometimes a ship would go weeks without finding prey. Hunger and boredom made tempers short and danger more likely. Small arguments over rations or cards could spiral into full-blown fights. The quartermaster's job became harder. Rations had to be stretched, biscuits soaked in vinegar to soften them, bits of salted meat cut thinner, watered-down grog passed off as a full drink. Hunger sharpened the senses, made dreams more vivid, made every creak. When the winds shifted for the monsoons, when hurricane season began, and when the trade routes would be busiest. They counted time by the number of ships captured, the number of days since land, or by personal milestones, like the day a man lost a finger in a boarding fight, or the week they ran out of tobacco. At a share, a vote, and a voice, they could endure anything. But when fairness cracked, everything else followed. Sometimes a ship would go weeks without finding prey. Hunger and boredom made tempers short and danger more likely. Small arguments over rations or cards could spiral into full-blown fights. The quartermaster's job became harder. Rations had to be stretched, biscuits soaked in vinegar to soften them, bits of salted meat cut thinner, watered-down grog passed off as a full drink. Hunger sharpened the senses, made dreams more vivid, made every creak of the ship feel louder. Some men went mad under the sun, staring for hours at nothing, their minds unraveling in the endless blue. Others turned cruel, finding reasons to pick fights or vent their frustration on the weaker members of the crew. A clever captain knew how to manage these moods, sometimes with a feast if supplies allowed, sometimes with a sudden raid, even if the prize was small. Action, any action, was better than waiting. Death at sea rarely came clean. A cannonball could shatter a leg, but infection was what killed. A splinter from a shattered mast could bury itself deep in the flesh, unnoticed until fever set in. Even a toothache could become fatal if left untreated. Some pirates dealt with this by numbing themselves with rum, others by sheer will. Those who feared slow deaths sometimes asked to be left behind rather than die coughing in the dark. Mercy killings weren't common, but they happened, especially in the quiet, far from any port or priest. The crew would bury their dead at sea, sometimes with a few words, sometimes just silence. A favorite weapon might be sent down with the body, or a coin placed over the eyes if they had any to spare. Superstition said the coin paid the ferryman. Others just believed it kept the dead from haunting the living. Storms were something else entirely, a force of nature that no blade could fight, no flag could outrun. When the sky turned the color of lead and the sea rose in great, heaving swells, pirates became small again. Everything that seemed strong and wild, masts, sails, courage, became fragile. The ship groaned like a living thing, and the crew clung to ropes, buckets, and each other. Lightning lit the sky in terrifying flashes, making every face look ghostly. Rain fell in sheets, blinding and deafening. The wind screamed through the rigging like it wanted to tear the ship apart with its bare hands. Men tied themselves to the masts to keep from being swept overboard. Others prayed or shouted defiance, or just worked, hauling, patching, climbing. When the storm passed, there was always a strange hush. Everything soaked, sails torn, barrels scattered, maybe a few missing. But if the ship still floated, there was gratitude, grim, silent, but real. Pirates feared capture, not just because of death, but because of the trial that came before it. Courts were not kind to men with black flags and long records. If caught, a pirate might be dragged in chains before a judge in a powdered wig, surrounded by officers and merchants who wanted revenge. Testimonies would be read, some true, some exaggerated. Witnesses might be brought in, or logs from captured ships shown as evidence. The pirate rarely had a chance to speak much, and when he did, it was usually met with laughter or disgust. Sentences were swift, hanging usually, though some were branded, whipped, or imprisoned for life. Executions were public. Crowds gathered to jeer. Some pirates used these final moments to spit curses at the crown, shout jokes, or sing. Others stayed silent, staring out at the horizon, as if imagining one last escape. Their bodies were left hanging as warnings, their stories turned into state-approved cautionary tales. And yet, even as the Golden Age waned, piracy never truly died. It simply changed shape, moving to new oceans, hiding behind official titles, merging with politics and war. The men who once called themselves free sailors disappeared into history books and nightmares. But their legacy remained. In every whisper of rebellion, every ship that refused to lower its flag, every tale told in secret about treasure and ghostly ships, the spirit of piracy survived. Not as a thirst for gold, but as a hunger for freedom, for living outside the rules, for choosing danger over dullness. And the sea, still vast, still mysterious, still full of wind and wave and uncharted paths, waited patiently. It always does. There were moments, rare and quiet, when a pirate ship would find itself becalmed, adrift in a windless void where the sails hung limp and the ocean surface shimmered like oil. These dead calms could last hours, days, sometimes longer. The ship wouldn't move. The air grew heavy, thick, and hot. Sweat clung to every pore. The crew moved slowly, if at all, their tempers rising with the heat. Food spoiled faster, water tasted fouler, and even the rats seemed listless. In those moments, time seemed to twist. Men would lie on the deck, staring at the sky, whispering to each other, or singing just to break the silence. Some would carve small marks into the wood with their knives, counting each hour like prisoners in a cell. Others spoke of omens, of sea spirits that stole the wind, or cursed men who'd angered the ocean. But they waited, because there was nothing else to do. It was during these still, suffocating spells that hallucinations were most common. Reflections on the water could play tricks, turning a bird into a distant sail, or a shadow into a ship. Sunstroke made men see things that weren't there. Green islands full of fruit, old lovers waiting on the horizon, or gold glinting in the waves. Some pirates swore they saw floating cities, strange shapes beneath the surface, or ships from centuries past drifting silently by. A few laughed it off. Others grew terrified. The line between what was real and what was imagined became thin as thread. These spells tested a crew in ways that storms never could. You couldn't fight stillness. You couldn't repair it, bribe it, or sail through it. You could only endure. And when the wind finally returned, suddenly, like a gasp, it felt like rebirth. Even during more active voyages, there were roles on board that rarely made it into the legends. The cook, for example, held more power than most realized. With nothing but a cramped galley, spoiled ingredients, and constant motion, he had to feed dozens of men, keep them from falling ill, and maintain morale. A bad cook could poison a crew without meaning to. A good one could turn hardtack and salt pork into something that resembled a meal. He also heard everything: gripes, plans, dreams, because men talked when they were hungry. Then there was the sailmaker, whose steady hands kept the ship flying, or the cooper, who made and repaired barrels to keep powder dry and water safe. Each role had weight, and a ship without them was doomed. The legends spoke of captains and gold, but those who lived it knew. The quiet hands kept the ship alive. Not every raid ended in battle. Sometimes the sight of a pirate flag was enough. Merchant ships, especially those carrying families or valuable cargo, might surrender without a shot fired. In those moments, the pirates would board, disarm, search the hold, and leave the crew intact, sometimes even giving them a bit of food or water to get home. It was efficient, cleaner, and preserved the pirates' reputation. A bloodless raid made future targets more likely to give up quickly. But if a ship resisted when it could have surrendered, the punishment was brutal. Pirates had little patience for pride. A captain who chose a firefight and got his men killed was often made an example of. Some were tossed into the sea, others forced to watch their ship burn. Pirates knew that fear was a weapon, and every act, merciful or monstrous, shaped how the next crew reacted. Among pirates, laughter was a kind of armor. It filled the long, empty stretches between storms and raids. They laughed at danger, at death, at each other. They laughed at the absurdity of life at sea, at how fast a man could lose everything, and how strange it was to survive at all. Gallows humor flourished. Men joked about the hangman, about curses, about being swallowed whole by sea beasts. They made bets on who would lose a finger next, who would get hit by a falling pulley, who would be struck by lightning. It wasn't just coping. It was culture. Laughter was the crack that let light in, the sound that proved they were still alive. Even in the midst of chaos, you might hear a pirate cackling through the smoke, blood dripping from his arm, grinning like the storm was a game. During the dark watches of the night, when only a few crewmen were awake, the world felt suspended. The stars seemed impossibly close. The sea glowed faintly with phosphorescence, tiny lights flickering in the water like scattered embers. Those on watch spoke quietly, or not at all. It was a time for thinking, remembering, regretting. Some pirates would whisper to the sea, to lost brothers, to gods they hadn't spoken to in years. Others would hum lullabies from their childhoods or stare for hours at constellations they couldn't name. This was when the past crept in. Face, voices, the smell of a mother's cooking, the sound of a city street. It was when even the hardest men seemed human, But when the sky began to lighten and the rest of the crew stirred, they'd shake it off. The masks went back on. The pirate world didn't leave room for softness. As piracy began to fade from the Golden Age into grim survival, some crews tried to retire together. They pooled gold, found a distant stretch of coast, and built shacks or longhouses. They planted gardens, tried raising pigs or chickens, and dreamed of peace. For a time, it might work. They'd drink around a fire, tell stories, and watch the stars without needing to sail toward them. But old habits died hard. Some grew restless. Others drank too much. Rumors of treasure or revenge lured them back to sea. Fights broke out. The settlements unraveled. A few were burned by the very men who built them. Others were discovered by colonial forces and wiped away. The dream of a pirate utopia never truly held. They were too wild, too free, too haunted by what they'd done. The sea had changed them. And peace, it seemed, was a life they had already traded away. Weapons on a pirate ship were both tools of war and tokens of pride. The typical arsenal included cutlasses, short, curved swords ideal for close combat in tight quarters, and flintlock pistols, often carried in pairs or threes since they took too long to reload mid-fight. Many pirates also carried daggers tucked into belts, sleeves, or boots, each blade personalized with notches, carvings, or a wrapping of cloth from a past kill. There were boarding axes used to chop through hatches or cleave into enemies, and belaying pins, usually used for tying ropes, that doubled as clubs. Cannons lined the decks, their mouths blackened with soot, often loaded with whatever would cause the most damage: nails, chain links, broken glass, or sharpened scraps of metal. Gunpowder was kept dry in sealed barrels, sometimes hidden behind false walls, to avoid detection. Pirates might have been lawless, but they understood firepower with chilling precision. A well-timed broadside could mean the difference between a fortune and a funeral. But pirates didn't only rely on brute force. They understood the value of speed, agility, and terror. Boarding was an art form, fast, chaotic, and overwhelming. Smoke from gunfire and cannon blasts filled the air, blinding both sides. Grappling hooks would fly across the gap between ships, and within seconds, the pirates would swarm over the sides like ants. Screaming, howling, weapons raised. This show of fury was as much psychological as tactical. Fear broke discipline. If the enemy crew hesitated, if they froze or turned to flee, the pirates already had the upper hand. Most ships surrendered before it reached that point. But when they didn't, the fighting was short and savage. There was no room for mercy in the heart of a battle. Later, in the quiet aftermath, the crew would count their losses, mop blood from the deck, and repair the torn sails, already thinking about the next one. For many pirates, dreams were strange and intense. Some claimed the sea infected their minds, that sleeping near water under the stars caused visions. Nightmares were common: drowning, burning, being left behind. Others dreamed of treasure, of long-lost loves, of battles that never happened. There were men who swore they saw ghosts on foggy mornings, shapes of old ships on the horizon, or dead crewmates staring up from the waves. Superstitions blossomed in this uncertainty. Some pirates wore lucky charms: teeth, bones, small dolls, bits of cloth from a lover's dress, a stone from a specific island. Others had rituals, whispering to the figurehead, never setting sail on certain days, never speaking a dead man's name aloud. They lived in a world where anything could kill them. so if a charm or a habit kept the fear at bay, no one questioned it. Though piracy was outlawed, pirates sometimes considered themselves political in their own rough way. Some saw their rebellion as more than greed. It was a rejection of monarchs, of taxation, of being treated as expendable tools of empire. They called themselves free men, not just thieves. Their ships operated as tiny republics, where every man had a vote, and leadership was earned, not inherited. The pirate articles, or codes, were democratic at a time when most of the world was still ruled by kings. A captain could be removed by vote. Plunder was shared by rule, not favor. Punishment was decided collectively. It was a hard life, but fairer than the naval ships they'd deserted, or the plantations they'd fled. In that sense, piracy offered something most of the world didn't: a chance to choose your fate, however bloody that choice might be. Some pirates were former slaves, indentured servants, or escaped convicts who'd found freedom on the sea. For them, piracy wasn't just a crime. It was salvation. A life of back-breaking labor or imprisonment was traded for a place on a ship where they were treated as equals, so long as they pulled their weight and fought well. Pirate crews were often more racially and culturally diverse than any navy, because survival mattered more than birth. Black, white, native, mixed. None of it mattered if you could sail, fight, and bleed alongside the others. Some even rose to command ships, led crews, carved their names into coastal legends. These men lived on the edge of the world, but for the first time, they chose where that edge would be. In the darkest corners of taverns and shipyards, rumors of legendary pirates circulated like currency. Not just Blackbeard or Calico Jack. There were names less famous, but whispered with awe. The captain who disappeared with 5 ships and was never seen again. The woman who wore a crown of shark teeth and was said to control the storms. The one-eyed surgeon who killed with poison, not steel. These weren't always real people. Sometimes they were composites of dozens of stories, stitched together into a myth that made enemies nervous and crewmates loyal. Pirate stories grew like vines, twisting, overlapping, becoming more vivid with every telling. They were cautionary tales, recruitment pitches, and bedtime stories for those who no longer slept. In the pirate world, being remembered was almost as good as being rich. Port cities played their own role in this world of shadows. Places like Port Royal, Nassau, Tortuga, they were more than harbors. They were breathing, pulsing organisms where law and lawlessness rubbed shoulders. Dockside brothels, smoky taverns, crooked merchants, and back-alley surgeons filled their streets. A pirate might come ashore for a night, spend a year's earnings on rum and companionship, and wake up with nothing but a headache and a missing boot. Others came to sell stolen cargo through shady dealers who asked no questions. These cities were dangerous, but essential. They were places where pirates became legends, or where legends disappeared. Everyone watched everyone. A wrong word, a misstep, and the gallows waited. But for a while, these places felt like kingdoms of freedom, where the rules bent and men made their own fate. As pirate ships grew older, their bones began to betray them. Wood warped, ropes frayed, iron rusted. Planks creaked louder, sails tore easier, and the masts groaned with every wind. Keeping a ship alive became a job that never ended. Carpenters became the heart of the crew. Patch, ing leaks with tar-soaked cloth and scavenged planks, working by lantern light deep in the ship's belly, where the air smelled of salt, smoke, and old sweat. Every creak was a warning, every soft spot in the wood a potential grave. The pirates patched and braced, reinforced and prayed, knowing that even the sturdiest ship eventually grew tired. When a vessel became too frail to trust in battle, some crews beached her on a remote coast and dismantled her plank by plank, burning what couldn't be salvaged and building with what remained. Others sailed their dying ship into a final glorious fight, hoping to go out with flame and fury rather than rot and silence. A pirate ship wasn't just a machine. It was a home, a weapon, a memory. Saying goodbye to one was like burying a friend. Each pirate developed their own private rituals before battle. Some sharpened their blades in silence, whispering to themselves. Others kissed lucky charms, muttered names of lost comrades, or stared at the sea until called. Many tied red scarves or strips of cloth around their arms or heads, not to match or intimidate, but simply to be recognized by their own during the smoke and confusion. A few painted their faces, streaking soot or blood across cheekbones like war paint. It was less about fear and more about becoming something other than a man, something fast, savage, and unflinching. They called it putting on your storm face. Some drank, some vomited, some laughed uncontrollably. And when the drum beats or shouts began, when the captain raised his sword and the ship closed in, those rituals vanished into the roar. But every pirate knew the real battle started long before the first shot was fired. Though often seen as heartless, pirates had their codes when it came to prisoners. Captains and officers might be ransomed for gold, especially if they came from wealthy families. Some crews treated prisoners decently, offering food and shelter until negotiations were complete. Others gave captives a chance to join, especially if they were skilled or desperate. A surgeon, a carpenter, even a good cook could earn a place with a cut of the loot. Those who refused were sometimes set adrift in small boats, with minimal supplies and a distant chance of rescue. But if a prisoner had shown cruelty, tried to deceive the pirates, or attempted sabotage, mercy vanished. The punishment could be swift or slow and cruel. Stories spread of men marooned with a single bullet and no food, or tied to the mast as warning. These weren't just punishments. They were messages, etched in salt and memory, meant to echo across the sea. Marooning, being left behind on a deserted island, was one of the most feared fates among pirates. Unlike hanging, it was slow, uncertain. Sometimes it was a sentence for mutiny or theft, sometimes just the brutal outcome of a vote. The crew would row the condemned men ashore, give him a small cask of water, maybe a pistol with a single shot, and sail away without a word. Some islands had food, coconuts, birds, crabs, and freshwater springs. Others were nothing but rock and despair. A marooned pirate had to become a castaway, turning survival into an art. There are tales of such men building shelters, crafting signals in the sand, and waiting for months before another ship came. A few were rescued. A few even forgave their crew and rejoined them. But most disappeared, swallowed by hunger, madness, or the indifferent silence of the ocean. Their footprints vanished with the tide, as if they'd never existed. In moments of rare peace, some pirates kept journals, scraps of paper, bound with string, hidden under hammocks or sewn into coats. These weren't grand tales or boastful logs. They were personal, full of misspellings, smudges, and quiet truths. A description of the sunrise on a still morning, a a sketch of a crewmate's face, a list of names, some crossed out. A recipe for stew that reminded the writer of home. Some journals contained prayers, half-remembered lines to long-forgotten gods. Others held curses, promises, or secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. These writings were never meant for readers. They were anchors to memory, proof that beneath the rough skin and stolen gold, there still lived people trying to make sense of their place in a world that offered little safety. When pirates died, these journals were often burned, buried, or thrown into the sea, returning their words to the tides. Not all treasure was found in chests. Some pirates prized knowledge above coin. A navigator's book, a rare map showing a hidden current, a coded message between colonial powers. These could be more valuable than silver. Pirates who could read and write were rare, and thus highly respected. They became record keepers, code breakers, and secret keepers. Some knew multiple languages and were tasked with translating stolen logs or treaties. Others copied maps by hand, tracing coastlines with obsessive care. They were also the ones who handled letters, sometimes fake, sometimes real, sent to contacts ashore. A letter written in a pirate's name could forge alliances, arrange trades, or spark mutiny. Written words, handled by rough hands, were power. A quiet man with a pen might influence more than the captain with a sword. And so, deep below deck, by flickering lanterns, knowledge was hoarded like gold, scratched into paper with ink made from soot and spit. In battle, noise was everywhere. Gunshots, cannon blasts, shouting, the thud of boots, the tearing of sails. But after battle came silence. The dead were gathered quickly, wounds bound with whatever cloth could be spared, and the ship cleaned of blood and debris. A strange hush followed, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. Those who lived examined the damage, broken railings, splintered wood, empty powder casks, and counted their luck. Some men sat alone, staring into the water. Others laughed too loudly, already retelling the fight with exaggerations. But everyone felt it, the invisible weight of what had just passed. Sometimes a man would carve a mark into the mast or scratch a date into his blade's hilt, not to celebrate, just to remember, because each battle survived felt like a debt unpaid, a favor borrowed from fate that would one day come due. Food aboard a pirate ship was a constant source of struggle, complaint, and creative compromise. Fresh provisions spoiled quickly in the heat and dampness of sea life. What remained were salted meats so tough they had to be boiled for hours, biscuits so old they crumbled into weevils and dust, and whatever dried beans or rice could be scavenged or stolen. The drinking water, stored in wooden barrels, often turned slimy and foul within weeks. Some pirates preferred to drink weak beer or grog, rum diluted with water and citrus, just to avoid illness. Rats sometimes found their way into the flour, and crewmen would simply sift them out without a second thought. Anything edible was valuable. Sea turtles, caught when possible, were a luxury. So were stolen chickens or pigs from merchant ships. The cook became both a scavenger and a magician, stretching limited ingredients into something barely passable. Spices, if they had them, were guarded like treasure. Pepper, nutmeg, or even just salt could make the difference between food and punishment. While daily life was rough, special occasions were treated with surprising ceremony. Victories were toasted. Birthdays, if remembered, might involve a stolen fruit, a shared cigar, or the rare luxury of music and dance. A successful raid might be celebrated with a day off from duties, extra rations, or a round of dice games. Crews made their own music: fiddles, drums fashioned from barrels, the steady rhythm of boots on deck, and voices raised in coarse, joyful song. There were dances, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes sincere. Even the fiercest men could be seen swaying or stomping along, boots thudding against the planks under starlight. For a few hours, the ship became something else, a place of laughter, not survival. And then, as always, the mood shifted. The music faded, the lanterns were doused, and silence returned like a tide. Pirates' relationships with religion were complicated. Many had been raised in faith, but abandoned it after years of blood and betrayal. Others held fast to belief, carrying tiny icons or crosses around their necks, offering prayers before battles, and asking forgiveness for sins they never planned to stop committing. Shipboard chaplains were rare, but not unheard of. Usually men who had once served in churches before turning to the sea. There were also strange mixtures of belief among crews made up of men from every corner of the world. Some burned incense, others marked their arms with protective symbols, and some whispered to sea gods and spirits that didn't appear in any Bible. They made offerings, pouring the first drop of rum into the ocean, carving faces into figureheads, avoiding certain rituals on cursed days. Superstition blended with spirituality until it was impossible to tell which was which. The sea, after all, inspired awe. Its moods were unknowable, its wrath biblical. For a pirate, faith was sometimes the only comfort left. Clothing often bore the marks of battle and sea life. A pirate's coat might be stitched together from 5 others, each scrap a memory. Holes were patched with sailcloth, buttons replaced with bones, and sleeves shortened after too many close calls with blades. Jewelry told its own stories. Rings cut from plundered gold, earrings worn as signs of past kills, beads or teeth threaded onto cords and worn proudly. Tattoos were common, inked by hand using needles and soot. Some marked maps, others showed ships, skulls, or strange symbols that only the crew understood. A man's body became a record of places he'd sailed, people he'd killed, oaths he'd made. When a pirate died, these marks were sometimes used to identify him. But more often, they vanished with him into the sea. One more story untold. Though pirate ships were violent places, there were moments of tenderness hidden in plain sight. 2 men sharing a hammock in the dead of night, a quiet hand on a shoulder before a fight, a carved trinket passed from one to another, with no words. Some relationships were romantic, others simply deep companionship forged in shared danger. There were those who mourned crewmates like brothers, carrying pieces of their belongings for years after their deaths. Some pirates made secret pacts. If one died, the other would bury his belongings or return to a port city to deliver a letter that might not even be real. These bonds weren't always spoken of, but they were powerful. In a world where life could be snuffed out in seconds, every connection mattered. Even the hardest pirates knew what it meant to lose someone who had fought beside you, bled with you, laughed with you, when no one else was listening. A pirate's life didn't end at death, at least not in the minds of those left behind. The sea was believed to hold souls, lost captains, crews sunk in storms, men who'd been betrayed and left to drown. Some ships were said to be haunted, their timbers groaning in strange winds, their lanterns glowing even when unlit. Sailors whispered of ghost ships, silent vessels seen drifting on moonless nights, sails full though there was no wind, no crew visible on the deck. Aboard, pirates left small offerings for the dead, a coin tucked into a crack in the mast, a blade placed beneath the sleeping mat, a muttered word before sleeping. They honored the ghosts because they knew they might become one. Death was never far. The sea didn't forget, and whether in memory, in myth, or in the crashing of the waves against a quiet hull, the dead sailed alongside the living, always. When pirates encountered ships from other cultures, the results were unpredictable. Sometimes it led to violence, misunderstanding, and chaos. Other times, it created moments of unexpected exchange. Pirates might trade goods, words, or gestures with Arab, Indian, Chinese, or African sailors. A few learned entire phrases, picked up songs or dances, and even joined festivals in foreign ports where no one asked too many questions. They marveled at textiles, spices, music, instruments they had no names for. They watched strange rituals with curiosity, confusion, or admiration. In rare cases, pirates married in local communities and stayed, blending into villages where their pasts didn't follow. These cross-cultural meetings were never neat or easy, but they left impressions, smells, sounds, and objects that traveled from ship to ship, world to world, until the pirate vessel itself became a patchwork of everywhere and nowhere at once. The Golden Age of Piracy may have faded in official records, but in the minds of those who lived it, it never truly ended. The sea continued to call, even as governments cracked down, as navies expanded, as hangings grew more frequent and legends were rewritten into cautionary tales. Some still took to the water. They were quieter, more cautious, but the spirit remained. The last embers of that wild freedom glowed in hidden coves and whispered plans, in ships that sailed without flags, in stolen maps passed hand to hand in flickering candlelight. For every one that was caught, another slipped through the cracks. And somewhere, beneath the stars, another crew raised a sail and steered into the unknown, not for gold alone, but for the chance to live untamed, if only for a little while longer. Sometimes, after years at sea, a pirate would try to walk away. They'd take their share of the loot, if they still had it, and vanish into a port town, pretending to be a trader, a fisherman, or even a humble farmer. Some tried to start over with a new name, a new wife, a small house near the coast. But the sea had marked them, their posture, their scars, the way they moved. It gave them away. And worse, the quiet land life moved too slowly. No tides to chase, no sails to fix, no wind to read. They'd sit for hours, staring at nothing, flinching when thunder rolled in, gripping knives at the creak of a door. For many, the stillness was unbearable. Some drank themselves into silence. Others vanished one night, leaving a bed still warm and heading back toward the shore where a ship might take them. The land was safe, but to them, it felt like a cage. The sea, though cruel, had been their home. In the rare moments when a pirate crew took a prisoner who intrigued them, an educated noble, a cunning trader, or a foreign captain, some surprising conversations took place. Between threats and bluster, there were exchanges of ideas, news from across the world, even philosophy. Pirates listened with curiosity to tales of courts, colonies, and conflicts far beyond their charts. They scoffed at kings and nobles, but were eager for information. A pirate might ask what the newspapers were saying, how wars were unfolding, or what the price of sugar had become. Some were shockingly informed, having pieced together a picture of the world from stolen books, drunken officials, and whispered dockside rumors. They saw themselves as part of something larger, a shifting balance of power, a world where no flag was sacred, and every nation, in the end, could be robbed. Pirates didn't just take gold. They gathered knowledge, gossip, and tactics. They were predators, yes, but not blind ones.